In this lesson, you will examine a video case study of self-regulation in action. We are going to Loretto College School in Toronto, Canada, where resource teachers Diane Vautour and Danielle Poupelin worked with a senior level English class to study poetry through the lens of resistance art with a view to writing a spoken word poem of choice. This video presents a unit of work from Diane and Daniel's senior level English class in a school in Canada. As part of the unit plan, Diane and Daniel's class of 17-year-old girls studied poetry through the lens of resistance with a view to writing a spoken word poem of choice that pushes against issues of oppression. The unit culminated with participation in a Skype video conference with classes across Canada and spoken word artists from Egypt and the United States. During this global conference, students had a chance to recite their poems and receive feedback. The objectives of the unit were as follows: provide students with the opportunity to investigate social issues and solutions and to address them through poetry. Make connections with the real world to explore resistance and social change. Build upon the school's specialist high skills major program that has a non-profit focus by having students address social issues, injustice and oppression through poetry and sharing their work with an international audience. The unit of work comprised of 6 lessons which took place over a 3-week period. In the first lesson, students learned about the history of spoken word poetry and the beginning of poetry slam competitions. They also learned what makes a successful slam poem. Diane and Daniel used a TED Talk by Harry Baker, the 2012 World Grand Slam Poetry Champion, to teach the students about spoken word poetry. As part of his TED Talk, Baker recited a number of poems. Using a teacher-designed template, students were instructed to analyze these poems in terms of style, structure, and performance. They were also asked to rate the poems out of 10 and to explain why they awarded a particular mark. On completion of this activity, the class collectively discussed and defined a set of success criteria for a successful spoken word poem. In Lesson 2, students were introduced to the concept of resistance poetry, and they investigated how different elements of resistance are tackled through spoken word poetry. The class began by discussing and defining resistance art with the students. Once they understood the concept of resistant art, the remainder of the class was structured like a slam poetry event. To do this, students were given a Prezi presentation. Embedded in the Prezi were a number of videos featuring poets performing poems which placed emphasis on discrimination based on gender and race, disparity of wealth and power, and confronting death and failure. Students were asked to view and rate a number of these poems. They were also asked to comment on a poem's ability to resist, comment on one aspect from the success criteria that they found was especially effective in the poem, identify and explain which slam poem best exemplified resistance art, identify and explain which was their favourite slam poem based on the performances, and continue to revise their success criteria of a successful word poem. Like before, once the class had completed this activity, the students collectively discussed and outlined the success criteria of a successful resistance poem. This set of criteria was later used to develop the assessment rubric that was used to evaluate the students' final poems. Following these lessons, the students were presented with an assignment in which they were asked to write and present a spoken word poem of choice that pushes against issues of oppression. To do this, students had to select a resistance topic of choice and then to create a PowerPoint presentation that demonstrated their knowledge of that issue and why resistance is needed. The PowerPoint had to include images, graphs, statistics, quotes, and anything else deemed necessary to provide an in-depth perspective of the issue in question. Students then shared these presentations in small groups. Using a teacher-designed checklist, they provided feedback to each other. Students received copies of the checklists at the end of the lesson, and they could use these to self-assess their presentation style and content. At this point, the students also collectively created a rubric that outlined the success criteria that would be utilized for assessment. The students had approximately 1 week to craft their spoken word poem. During this, 2 spoken word experts conducted mini workshops with the students. While a Skype call was conducted with Professor Daniel Scott Tisdale, both provided insight on how to begin and successfully craft a spoken word poem, and students were encouraged to question them about the writing process and to seek advice towards overcoming the barriers they were encountering while writing their spoken word poems. Students revised their work based on this feedback, as well as on feedback from Daniel and Diane. In the penultimate lesson, students performed their resistance spoken word poem in front of their peers, who provided feedback according to the success criteria established in class. Final revisions were made based on this feedback. The final activity in the unit of work was participation in a video conference organised by the Centre for Global Education and that addressed the use of poetry as a means of resistance. During the conference, students heard from a young revolutionary in the Middle East and a poet from the United States as they shared their poetry about transition and injustice. They were also given the opportunity to share their poem and receive feedback from individuals living thousands of miles away.
We were never meant to be that self-equal type of delicate. We were born outshine the sun.
Please watch the video again and take note where you see evidence of self-regulation. Jot these down and make notes of what level you would code it and why.
be that self-sequel type of delicate we were born to outshine the sun.
We are now going to look at this video once more. This time, it will highlight evidence of the different levels of self-regulation. See how they compare to what you noted. The unit of work was carried out by Diane and Daniel in their senior level English class in Canada. Students studied poetry through the lens of resistance art with a view to writing and performing a resistance spoken word poem of choice at a global video conference. This video is based on this unit of work and highlights how students were required to use self-regulation skills as they crafted their resistance spoken word poems. To remind you, when examining a unit of work or learning activity for self-regulation, the following questions are asked. Is the learning activity long-term? And do students have learning goals and success criteria in advance? Do students plan their work? Do students have the opportunity to revise work based on feedback? Length of time is a basic prerequisite for students' opportunity for self-regulation. A learning activity is considered long-term if students work on it for a substantive period of time. This unit of work comprised of 6 lessons which took place over a 3-week period. It is therefore considered to be long-term. When students have learning goals and associated success criteria in advance of completing their work, it is possible for them to examine the progress and quality of their own work as they do it. The educator might provide learning goals and associated success criteria to students, or the class might negotiate the learning goals and success criteria together to foster more student ownership. As outlined in the previous video, students in Diane and Daniel's class defined a set of success criteria for resistance spoken word poems. Then, as students crafted their own spoken word poems, they were advised by their teachers to keep checking the success criteria to ensure they were being successful. This set of criteria was also used by the students to develop the assessment rubric that was used to evaluate the quality of the students' final poems. When students plan their own work, they make decisions about the schedule and steps they will follow to accomplish the task. In this activity, students planned their work by making their own deadlines for completing their research, writing their poems, and practicing them. Students have the opportunity to revise their work based on feedback when feedback is given and explicitly used to improve the work before it is submitted or finalized. Feedback may come from the educator or from peers. Students might also have the opportunity to revise their work based on their own deliberate process of self-reflection. Students in Diane and Daniel's class were provided with many opportunities to revise their work based on feedback. As they composed their resistance art poems, help and advice was provided by 2 spoken word experts during a mini workshop. A Skype call was also conducted with a professor from the University of Toronto. During both sessions, students were encouraged to ask questions about the writing process and to seek advice towards overcoming any barriers they were encountering while writing their spoken word poems. Students revised their work based on this feedback, as well as on feedback from Daniel and Diane. Finally, students performed their poems in front of their peers in the penultimate lesson. They provided feedback according to the success criteria established in class, and final revisions were made based on this feedback. The unit of work carried out by the students in Daniel and Diane's class is coded at a 4. This is because the activity is long-term and students had the learning goals and success criteria in advance, students planned their work, Students had the opportunity to revise work based on feedback. Now that we've examined self-regulation in action and looked at how we can apply the 21 CLD rubric to design a learning activity that develops students' self-regulation skills, consider what sort of learning activity you could create to help develop your students' self-regulation skills. In this lesson, we have looked at self-regulation in action. In the next lesson, we will look at how you can create self-regulation activities for your classroom.